Shalom and welcome to this edition of Contextual Bible Study. My name is Denny Thompson, and today we are on episode number 31, Fishing Stories. We're going to go back to the Sea of Galilee. Before we begin, if you find these presentations interesting and of value, if you could possibly follow the show if you aren't already, that would be great. Or like any episode that you particularly appreciate, or refer them to friends of yours that you think might be interested. That would be great. That would give me a little bit more exposure on YouTube and maybe have these presentations kind of reach out further. And I would highly appreciate that. So thank you for that. Now, just by way of review, if you remember back before when we first looked at the Sea of Galilee, we were talking about this whole idea of how the Jews, or the ancient Hebrews are later called the Jews, how they view the idea of the sea or water because they were land people. And so even going back to the original creation, this whole idea of the earth with its water and land forms, of course, above are the clouds, the sky, and above that, the waters above the firmament. But then to focus on the area beneath the earth, beneath the waters of the earth, connections going down to Sheol or the abyss, or actually a picture of hell itself, would be how this is viewed. So this is significant in understanding these stories, especially the ones around the Sea of Galilee. And of course, how Jesus walked on water. He walked on this abyss, which could have storms. These storms could come up and create all these obstacles, and yet he could walk right on top. Obviously, symbolically, meaning that he could control all of the toils of life, all those storms that come up. All right. Now, it's interesting that he chose the majority of his disciples, actually, who were fishermen. Now, we know from an account we're going to look at today in John 21 that actually there were 7 disciples that had been fishing. So initially there weren't that many fishermen, but eventually there were 7 who had obviously worked on the Sea of Galilee. They were Peter, Thomas, Nathaniel, James, and John, and then it lists 2 others who were likely Andrew and Philip, we think. And it's interesting why Jesus chose so many fishermen. What is there about fishermen that they become his followers, his disciples, his closest group? Well, the fisherman's work was incredibly demanding. So, kind of looking at into the character of fishermen here, maybe, insightful, trying to get ideas as to why did he choose fishermen. So, obviously, they had to row, often in really choppy waters, because the Sea of Galilee could have storms pop up so quick. To and from the fishing sites, they had to haul in very heavy nets, lifting catches of fish. Very demanding job, backbreaking, monotonous work. Most of their work was at night, and often it was very cold or damp. So this is not, this was not an easy job whatsoever. These guys were tough. They had to really, really be able to overcome all kinds of obstacles in order to be fishermen. And often, cast net fishermen, they had to dive under the water to retrieve their nets. Not something we don't normally think about, but that was true. Because night fishing was the most productive, fishermen often worked all night and slept during the day. The best fishing was in the winter months, the rainy season. In January and February, the Sea of Galilee's water temperature ranges in the 50s. I don't know if you've ever done any swimming in water in the 50s, but that is cold. So just kind of putting this all together, and the air temperature is around 57, this was not an easy job. These guys are really tough and hardy. So it's not something we maybe normally think of, but just to kind of put that in the back of your mind. This is a type of character of the majority of these disciples. The type of work they were actually doing was really, really difficult. Now, I showed you this map last time, but what we're going to look at is this area right out here. 2 different stories today, both very, very likely took place right here. And we'll see why in a minute. And this is also very likely where Jesus called his disciples. And also the place, as I mentioned before, where there are warm springs that come out in this area. And that was one of the reasons this was a good fishing area, because it attracted the fish, especially in the wintertime, during that time period. And also, this was an area, because of the warm springs that come up, and there were 7 of them, okay, there were many people who came here to be healed, to bathe in those warm springs. And so they were actually going to wind up meeting Jesus in many cases in these big multitudes of people. Very same place. Now, as Jesus was walking beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon called Peter and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net. Okay, so we know that. They were cast net fishing. We learned about that last time. Come follow me, Jesus said, and I will make you fishers of men. And once they left their nets and they followed him. Now, symbolically, fishers of men is going to come to mean rescuing from the abyss to life. That's kind of a symbolic meaning here, what actually is going on. So in the sense of the abyss of life itself, they becoming fishers of men were going to bring people to life through Jesus' teachings. Now, going on from there, he saw 2 other brothers, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They were in a boat with their father Zebedee, preparing their nets. Jesus called them, and immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. Now, they were really giving up a pretty substantial income and occupation. This could be quite profitable, fishing on the Sea of Galilee. So they were giving up a lot to follow this rabbi after he asked them the question. This event likely took place during the winter high fishing season. Often they needed to mend their nets from the boats, not on the shore, to save time because they were in the boat. And that usually means they were working in the boat. They weren't fishing at that time, so they're likely mending their nets. And we'll look at a little bit further about this later, but that probably meant that was wintertime during this high fishing season. And he said, come follow me, Jesus said. This had to be very shocking to them. Now, why? You might think, why would that be shocking? Well, this was not the normal way. This is not how this worked. Because when a young man wanted to follow a rabbi, he would come up to the rabbi, probably a rabbi that he had heard about or heard his teachings, one he really wanted to learn a lot more about, and he wanted to become a disciple or a talmid. It's called in Hebrew, which literally means student. So what he would do, he would prepare and he'd go up to the rabbi and say, I would like to follow you. He would say, I would like to follow you, not the other way around. Okay, so that's important to understand. Then the rabbi would say, well, thank you, young man. Let me ask you some questions. And he'd ask him questions from the Torah, from the Bible. And they'd be really, really difficult questions. He'd have to cite many verses from memory, and it was just really complicated. Most of them, by far, didn't pass the grade. They didn't make it. They didn't become a disciple, and they went back into their occupation. A few did, and the rabbi would say that you may follow me. Okay, at that point, though, and it's interesting that Jesus was the one who came to his disciples and said, come follow me. So it was definitely different than the normal custom. And it's interesting to think, and we have no way of knowing, but was it even possible that maybe some of the Jesus' disciples had previously asked another rabbi and maybe failed the test, or they didn't answer the questions the way the rabbi wanted? We don't know. It's just kind of speculation. Now, 2 stories we're going to look at today, Luke 5 and John 21. And I think both of them took place in the same place. First, Luke 5. And this was in this area, these 7 warm springs, where all these multitudes of fish would gather in the wintertime and the healing would take place. Okay, and of course, Jesus was going to be in this area a lot, and those people knew it. Now, one day as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, Sea of Galilee, with the people crowding around him and listening to the word of God, he saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by fishermen who were washing their nets. Okay, now this is a massive clue that they were out night fishing, and we'll learn more about that in a second, but that's what they were doing, and they were washing their nets in the morning. Okay, so that's when they would have been doing it. They were using a net called a trammel net we looked at last time, and they were likely fishing for a fish called tilapia, which was a very prized fish. When the night's fishing was completed, and the light of the morning begins to return, the fishermen return their boat to the shore. And the sections of the trammel net are separated. Now, this picture is from maybe about 80 or 90 years ago, fishermen, but the technique would have been the same way back then. The trammel net is separated, washed, and rinsed in the lake. The net is then hung up to dry on poles or on a wall. The fishermen carefully undo each tangle and make any necessary repairs with a special needle. If a trammel net is properly cared for, it lasts for 2 seasons. And that's it. So they had, because they were made out of linen, not nylon, as we mentioned before. Now, and I'm going to mention it again here. I want to look at this a little closer. The linen nets were made from flax. That's actually how they made them, from flax, the crop flax, which had to be dried to get it intact. They could only fish at night because of that, because this is visible. These nets were very visible. That's why the nets had to be dried and repaired every morning. They were pretty fragile and they had to be taken care of. So that's how they created these nets. As I mentioned last time, nylon wasn't until like 1939, the more invisible type net. So that's why night fishing was such a big deal, because the fish could see the nets. Now, he got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon, and asked him to put out a little from the shore. Okay, now it's interesting. Now, Jesus wanted Simon to be with him at this point. He was not all alone in that boat. Simon's with him. He wants Simon to stay in the boat. And of course, just as he does us, he wants to be with us. Now, there was kind of a cultural expectation back in those days to Peter or Simon. And the idea was this: Jesus had healed his mother-in-law, so kind of like Peter owed him one in a sense. So when Jesus asked to use his boat, Peter, although he probably would have said yes anyway, that would have been part of it too. Simon certainly did owe Jesus a favor because of what Jesus had done for him in healing his mother-in-law. Then he sat down. Now, this was a rabbi's custom of getting ready to teach. They would sit down and taught the people from the boat. Okay. Now, sometimes rabbis would teach for hours. So imagine Peter's there, and we don't know how long Rabbi Jesus taught at this time, but at times these would be very, very long. When he finished speaking, he said to Simon, "Put out into the deep water and let down the nets for a catch." Now, at first glance to us, that's like, okay, it makes, Jesus wants to go fishing, it sounds like, but there's a little more to this whole idea of going out into the deep. The deep in Hebrew is a word to home, and in Greek it's bathos, okay? And the idea of the deep, of course, kind of carrying this through from before, is rescue me from the mire, do not let me sink, deliver me from those who hate me from the deep waters. Though they hide from my eyes at the bottom of the sea, there I will command the serpent to bite them. So, again, this idea of the depth. Now, so they're going back out into the deep. Now, what that means is what they're going to be doing here is trammel net fishing. That's what's going on. It's not cast net, it'd be trammel net. That's what they did out there. If you remember this picture from last time I showed you, how they would line their net up. I kind of roughly drew it out there, out into the water. This tall net, pictured on the left, it went all the way to the bottom of the little lake. Corks floats on top, and then stone weights on the bottom. And then they would get everything ready. They would get that net all lined up, and the boat would be in that little opening area. And then they would make all kinds of noise to try to scare the fish to swim into that net, the trammel net, which had these progressively smaller and smaller openings. There are little holes in it, and the fish would get caught. Okay, so this is what they're doing, because this is happening at night. So it had to be this type of fishing. When the night's fishing is completed and the light of the morning begins to return, the fishermen return the boat to the shore. And as I mentioned, the sections of the net are separated, washed, and rinsed. The net is then hung up to dry on poles on a wall. The fishermen carefully undo each tangle and make any necessary repairs. Okay? Now, Simon had to be thinking, you might be a great rabbi, but I know fishing. If I do if I do it, well, if I do exactly what you're asking me, Rabbi Jesus, what are the people of the town going to think? Because this is not at all normal. Okay, we're in the morning. I got to care for these nets. I got to clean them, take care of them. And who in the world is going to go out there during the daytime with these nets? We'll never catch anything. Our nets will be ruined otherwise if we don't take care of them. And obviously, we can't catch fish during the day. He had to be incredibly exhausted and hungry. He was out all night, probably diving into this cold water. Now, this is a tough call when Jesus said this. And we miss that not knowing the background of the story, but it had to be a really tough call. But he said, in spite of whatever's going through his head, like, oh my goodness, please, he said, I will do as you say. And that is fascinating because that's true faith. So he had faith in his rabbi to say, I will do as you say, even though everything within him said, are you kidding me? This makes absolutely no sense. Now, what Peter was exhibiting here was true faith. The Hebrew word is emunah, because what that meant, and I covered this in the previous presentation, but faith meant is firmness, steadiness, persistence based on action. So in other words, doing what God said. And as I mentioned before, the first mention was Abraham being called and coming all the way from where he lived over to Canaan. Of course, that was faith. He did this in spite of the fact he really had no idea what God wanted, what was going to happen, but he knew he asked him to, so he did it. And in this case, Peter's showing faith. Now, Simon, Peter answered, Master, we've worked hard all night, obviously the time to fish, and we haven't caught anything. But because you say so, or at thy word in King James, I will let down the nets. Okay? And that's kind of an allusion back to God's creation at thy word. Now, when they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in the other boat to come and help them. Now, the partners in the other boat, during the high season, which means that during the winter time, actually that's the high season, when all these fish congregate, they usually worked in two boats. So they would have a boat on one side and a boat on the other so they could help out each other. And interesting enough, probably they weren't going to be yelling out to other fishermen on the lake, oh, look at all the fish we're catching, because of course fishermen like to keep that to themselves. They would have to signal to them and probably not scream at them to kind of keep, this great success a little bit quiet. No, I like to fish. I'm a fisherman. I mentioned this before, but I like to walleye fish. And I was thinking about this, and it's kind of funny, but actually, the way I apply this myself is if I'm fishing and I happen to have a walleye on, I'm catching one, and then I see another boat coming down the lake, I play a little bit of a trick where I'll take my rod and kind of put it down to the side of the boat and not hold it up in the air like, standing up like I'm pulling in a big fish. Kind of hide that a little bit so the other guy doesn't see it. And maybe it's a little bit of the same idea what they would do here. So anyway, they would work together during the height of the season because this was a very important time. And they came and filled both boats so full they began to sink. Now this is an incredible catch during the daytime. During the daytime this is happening here. Can you imagine? They can't even fathom what's going on here. All right, now this kind of fits previous miracles of Jesus. Out of nothing, Jesus gives abundance, more than we can anticipate. Examples of the very first miracle of water to wine, out of just water abundant in the highest quality wine. So this fantastic catch of fish Jesus was giving to them because of their faith. When Simon Peter saw this, he fell down at Jesus' knees and said, Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man. For he and his companions were astonished at the catch of fish they had taken. You can imagine how astonished they were, knowing the background now. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, Simon's partners. This was just stunning what had happened. And this is hearkening back to this verse in Isaiah. Because Peter's realizing, who is this Jesus? This truly is a miracle, what has just happened. Woe to me, I cried. I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. I think that's kind of an allusion back to this, what Peter's doing. Then Jesus said to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will catch men. So they pulled their boats up on shore, left everything, and followed him. All right, now, this is alluding to some examples here. I think probably several things. Probably this from Jeremiah. But now I will send for many fishermen, declares the Lord, and they will catch them. Okay, now see, Jesus is really, I think, alluding back to even this Old Testament, these scriptures here, because, of course, he's the completion of all of these previous ideas in these texts. Or this from Ezekiel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. With a great throng of people, I will cast my net over you, and they will haul you up in my net. So the symbolism of sinful people coming from the depths of the sea, taken out to be made alive. So that's kind of this whole idea. The fishermen are going to be rescuing people from the abyss in the sense they're going to become fishers of men through teachings, through Jesus' teachings, and showing people what the purpose of his coming was exactly all about. For in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. Now, the waters are not only symbol of the abyss or chaos, but also of Gentiles. So there's kind of another meaning here of the waters. Woe to the many nations that rage. They rage like the raging sea. Woe to the peoples who roar. They roar like the roaring of the great waters. Then the angel of the Lord said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So this picture is being widened out. It's going to the sea is going to represent the entire earth, the Gentiles in the entire earth. Now the second story is going to be in John 21. We're going to look at. Okay, and this. To the background to that, this is going to be the third time Jesus had met with his disciples after his resurrection. So we're moving way ahead of time through the Passover, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. And this is going to be the third meeting. It's going to be probably at the very same place of the story we just covered. Very, very likely. And as I mentioned, this is right after the events of the Passover and the crucifixion. Now, this is what Jesus had told the women who were who were the very first to see him after the resurrection, which is very fascinating, very interesting. We covered that. He said, but go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Now, why? Why Galilee? Why would they? You tell them that he wants to meet the disciples way back up here. Well, that's interesting because that's where they originally came from. Now, this is after the resurrection. So something else is happening now. Jesus is preparing them for the very next step of their lives, the next things that they're going to be involved with, which are incredibly important. So very likely we're at the same place, Tabgha, right? Again, in the same area. This took place, okay? And that name, as I mentioned before, is a corruption of a Greek term, heptagon, which means seven springs, simply. And this is, again, a picture. I showed you this last time of one that I took of one of the seven springs. Here's another one at this area here. These are warm mineral springs, especially great fishing during the winter, as I mentioned before, in tilapia. In the Bible, when you talk about large fish, they're talking about tilapia. Now, they're not like gigantic like salmon, but they're big compared to the smaller sardines, of course. And the story, though, in this case, took place in the spring, not the winter. That's important to understand. Because, how do we know that? Because it's after the Passover and the resurrection, and that's in the spring. So it's not the same time of year, but it very likely is exactly the same place. Now, in the spring, the tilapia are not by that place, not by Tabgha. That's in the winter, when the springs are bringing out warmer waters. In the spring, they're at the mouth of the Jordan River. Now, there's reasons we know all that. This has all been studied, Mendel Noon and others, from past history. They like some of the sediments coming out, but they congregate where the Jordan River, pictured above, goes into the Sea of Galilee. That's where they would be during the springtime. So that's important to understand. Now, the story. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. I am going out to fish, Simon Peter told them. And they said, we will go with you. Of course, Simon being the leader. Now, it is very likely they're fishing for sardines because it was springtime. Now, why? How do we know that? Well, that's the background of the fishing on the Sea of Galilee. That's what we know from studying where the fish are certain times of year. Because this is in the spring, the tilapia over by that mouth of the Jordan River, and the sardines are the ones that congregate or that they catch along these other areas around by Tabgha. So they have nets again, but they're smaller nets in order to be able to capture the sardines. And the sardines, remember, were 1/2 of the total value of the fish caught on the Sea of Galilee. So they're very, very important. They were dried and sent throughout the Roman world. They were eaten all over Israel, but also all around the Roman world and beyond. So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize it was Jesus. So picture that. They're in the boat, okay? They had been out all night. They didn't catch anything. And they see a shadow of somebody on the shore. And they didn't know who it was. Okay, they saw. He called out to them, children, haven't you any fish? Now that's interesting. Children. Why did this person, they're going to soon learn is Jesus, why did he call them children? Well, because were they really children? Well, Peter was the only one in the group that was 20 years or older, likely. We learned that from previous stories about remember the shekel, the half shekel, the temple tax, that whole thing of catching a fish and the coin in the mouth, enough for Jesus and Peter only, not the rest, because they're under 20 then, based on that story. And also based on the culture, these Talmud or Talmudim in plural were young. They were almost always high school kids or teenagers, I should say. Now, the rabbis had a habit of calling disciples sons or children. They did this a lot. This is what they did because they were training them up. And there was many expressions about this. I've discovered many of them. Here's one of them. Our Father brought us into the world, but our Rabbi will lead us into the world to come. So this whole idea of calling them children would be normal. Not we would think, okay, what's with that? Why do you do that? That was a normal custom back then. And this would have been in the early morning. I just put this picture in here to kind of get an idea. Probably a little bit darker than this, but they're looking at the shore. Very pretty as that sun just barely coming over the horizon, over the side there. No, this is going back to that question, have you caught fish? Jesus asked, no. He said, throw your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. All right, so throw your net meant they were cast net fishing. That's what they were doing. They were not doing this other trammel net in deeper waters, but cast net fishing. Okay, and they would use smaller nets that had smaller openings on them so they could catch these sardines, and that's very likely what's going on. So this is a picture of today of somebody throwing a net from a boat in this area, and this would be somewhat like what it would have been, probably about 100 yards off from shores where they were. They weren't right on the shore, and they certainly weren't in deep water either. Now, when they did this, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that's, of course, John. That's always interesting. John even describes himself that way. Said to Peter, it is the Lord. As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him and jumped into the water. So what's going on? Well, at this point, when they're fishing with cast nets, remember, oftentimes they had to dive into the water to capture the fish, and they'd kind of get the bottom little stone weights to make sure they could collect them all. And a lot of this was done by diving into the water, and when they did it actually without clothes on, because otherwise they'd be encumbered. So what's going on here is Peter was diving into, it would be, we can suppose that very likely he was the one catching the fish, or maybe others, but he certainly was. Um, and this was done, of course, naked for efficiency. But he's putting back on this garment, and then he's jumping back in the water. So it all seems kind of crazy, but because he's going to meet Jesus. So, just out of just the fact he's going up to meet Jesus, he's done fishing and he hears hears Jesus talking. Immediately, Peter, being so impulsive, he puts his garment back on and just jumps right into the water. The other disciples followed him in the boat. They didn't do the old jump in the water thing like Peter did, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. That's how we knew that 100 yards idea, just out a little bit. That's about how far out they would go on this type of cast net fishing. When they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. That's what they saw as they all came up. Peter first, and then the rest of them. And it's interesting that Jesus already had fish on the fire. So he'd already apparently captured some of his own, caught some of his own. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." So Simon Peter climbed back into the boat and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish. Okay, now, large fish are not sardines. That's tilapia. Wow. How in the world did tilapia get there? Because they weren't there in the spring. This is springtime because it's after Passover. And then he says 153, but even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, okay? And as I mentioned, these large fish were tilapia. Okay. Now, the events of Passover week, all but John had deserted Jesus. Okay. All of them. Remember, John was the only one at the cross. And here they are back with him again, having had this tremendous guilt of what had happened during that time period. This meal that Jesus is going to be having with his disciples is going to be a meal, what was called reconciliation. At the very place it all began, really probably the very place he called these guys as his disciples, which is really quite amazing. Now, why were there 153 large fish? There are many theories. I've read many of them. And my conclusion is, I don't know. It's just really too hard to understand. I think there's a lot to it, and I'm just not sure. But it's interesting that the disciples counted them, kind of to indicate, wow, look what this miracle was. It literally counted every single one of these large fish, these tilapia. All right, and as I mentioned before, normally they would be over by the Jordan River, which is to the right, and not by Tabgha. That's where the large fish would be, and the sardines would be here. But that's not what happened. They caught the large fish over by Tabgha. So in a sense of what is normal, it clearly was a miracle. The wrong fish, okay, because it should have been sardines and it wasn't. The wrong type of a net, because that's not even the type of net they use for tilapia. They didn't use those cast nets. They used those great big trammel nets. The wrong time of day for sure, because it was daytime and they caught those at night. The wrong area of the lake, as we know, and the wrong time of the year. So wow, all this was like totally different than what it normally should have been. This whole story taking place here in John 21. Now, what was right? As the disciples listened to Jesus and hauled in 153 large fish. They had faith and they did what he said. And that's exactly what was the result of the whole thing. So Luke 5 and John 21, as I said, were likely here. In John 21, the disciples were lost back, and they were back in their occupation again. They were lost after what had happened when Jesus was crucified. And here they were back up on the Sea of Galilee doing what they originally were doing. Jesus was affirming them, though. This is the beginning of an amazing plan he had for them. This is where they truly are going to begin the whole process of not being fishers of fish, but fishers of men. All right, exactly. That's what was happening here at this location. Now, one more event. They're having breakfast, and the traditional location of where this took place. Okay, as I mentioned before, let's look at that a little bit closer. There's a church right here called the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter. Up above it is the traditional Mount of Beatitudes. They kind of put this in reference. Capernaum would be beyond in the picture there in the Jordan River, where it comes in will be even a little further away in that corner. So anyway, we're right here by this church, this traditional location. And this is where this likely took place. The 7 springs in this area, the healing springs, and the breakfast with Jesus would have been somewhere near where this church is, right in this region here, right in this area of these springs. And this would have been where all these people came previously for healing, as I mentioned before. Okay, and then of course Jesus was present in this area previously, but now he's with his disciples, just his disciples. And this is after the resurrection. This is kind of a traditional rock right outside that church, which is a traditional location of this very breakfast. This is another picture of it right here. So if you visit Israel today, this would be the area that you would see to represent this John 21 incredibly important event. Now, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the 3rd time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Now, only 2 times fire is mentioned in the New Testament. Right here, John 21 and the picture you're looking at, which was hearkening back for Peter, an incredibly dark time in his life. What was that? Okay, the reference for that, the other time where the fire was that Peter was by, and it was mentioned in the New Testament, it happened to be Peter again, it was this. It was cold, and the servants and officials stood around a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter also was standing with them, warming himself. So this is what it was. Jesus addressing let me go back here just a second, addressing Peter's greatest failure, which had been an incredible heavy burden on him. All right, this whole time. So now they're back at another fire where Jesus is ready to kind of reinstate Peter for this great mission he has. When they finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Reinstating him as leader of the disciples is what's going on. And of course, back here at Caesarea Philippi, that I say to you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. And this, without getting too much into detail, we've covered this already, but Peter being really the single or the smaller stone on this massive rock, ultimately being Jesus, he was saying, you're going to be the leader. You're going to be the leader of this movement, Peter. And now he's saying, even though you failed me before here, before the crucifixion, now things are different. You're going to be reinstated. And also he had said back here, I'll give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, which is a remez or a reference back to Isaiah. I will place on his shoulder the keys to the house of David, and what he opens, not one can shut. What he shuts, no one can open. So that's what he's putting back. That's what he had given to Peter. He had assigned him to be the leader. And he's given this reassurance, yes, Peter, you are the leader, and I'm putting my full faith and trust in you. And Jesus said, feed my lambs. Again, Peter said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. The 3rd time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him a 3rd time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now, at these meals of reconciliation, as they were called, and Jesus, of course, is using this custom, before the meal covenant, the guilty party confesses his wrongdoing to the injured party, who accepts his confession. A suitable recompense is agreed upon, and the parties gather at the table for a joyous meal. So they're going to be coming back together, be reconciled over this meal. And that's really what's going on here at this breakfast. Even today, Bedouins have these meals. They're called sulhas, where they are reconciled back for some wrongdoing that has happened within different groups. The wrongdoing is not to be discussed again as if it never happened. Even I, am the one who wipes out your transgression for my own sake, and I will not remember your sin. So, but Jesus did say to Peter, he said, feed or take care of my lambs or sheep 3 different times. It looked like he was particularly using this idea to really have Peter understand that this is all going to be in the past now, all of it. Now he was to reconcile other wayward lambs back the same way Jesus had reconciled him. So he wanted him to fully understand by doing this, saying this 3 times, it's over. It's gone, Peter. You have an amazing mission ahead of you. Let's go. Did Peter believe Jesus' words about forgiveness and reconciliation? Well, I think we know he did, because what happened after this was nothing short of incredible. How Peter and the other disciples went around the known world at that time, and this message spread like unbelievable. It was really incredible how fast it went, because of the boldness and because they had learned this lesson. They were reconciled. Jesus' teachings and his meal of reconciliation certainly was affected, because boy, did they ever go out and be effective for him. And then, of course, is the question, do we believe Jesus' words about this too? Because sometimes the enemy wants to kind of put a thought in our mind, really? Could you be forgiven for what you just did? Yeah. Well, Jesus is saying, yes, you can. And I want to have this reconciliation so that I may use you for all of this mission that's in front of you. So thank you for watching today, this edition 31, in this case called Fishing Stories. And as I have said before, I like to end with the idea of shalom. In this verse right here, shalom I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your hearts be troubled, and do not be afraid. And this picture right here is that picture of Peter holding Jesus' hand on the trials of life, on the abyss itself, and on these storms. But he held his hand. And by holding Jesus' hand, and that's what he did the rest of his life. And Jesus is asking us to do the very same, because that is the only way to have true shalom. Thank you again for watching today. Shalom.